of context, recording in progress, great. So to provide a little bit of context, then there has been a huge conversation happened recently, and actually particularly in the past like year to 2 years, and particularly in the UK, about metascience. So metascience is literally science about science, just like metacognition is thinking about thinking. People who are interested in metascience, and I've started to introduce myself now as a meta scientist. People who do metascience are interested in applying research methodologies to empirically and theoretically and conceptually look at what do we do as researchers and how can we do that stuff better. Now, I think this is fascinating because it kind of felt like in the 2010s in psychology, there was a lot of concern about questionable research practices. There were a couple of high profile cases of academic fraud, of data fabrication. And what I think has kind of happened recently is that people have moved on from this concern about questionable, dodgy practices and have started legitimizing metascience as a discipline in its own right, which I think is just a really welcome kind of movement. So, for example, it was only last year that the UK government launched the first ever dedicated government-backed metascience unit. So the UK was one of the first governments ever to be like, we're going to put all of this money towards just funding research about research. So just funding research that looks at how are the structures of academia done and how can we do things better. And this kind of came out from one of the UNESCO recommendations, which is that we need to do more meta-scientific stuff. So as well as investigating like kind of new questions, let's all take stock of our practices and processes. And this is the stuff that just makes my heart sing because I just find this stuff fascinating. This has kind of been part of, as I'm sure you're all aware, usually when I present this stuff, it's to people of different disciplines, but I think as psychologists, I think we know a lot of this. But this has also been part of a much broader conversation about trying to open up science, so trying to open up research and have this kind of critical inward look to ask big questions like, okay, who is our research actually serving? How good are our methods? How can we make our work more transparent? How can we engage people in our work at the right time? And how can we generally open up this kind of black box of research? And it's kind of felt like there was a big movement about open science in like 2010, 2015, and now we're kind of moving into this legitimization of meta science as like a scholarly activity. So these are the kind of things that meta scientists care about, and this is the stuff that I really care about. So asking questions like, is the work that we do robust? How do we know it's robust? Whose standards of robustness are we using? How transparent is our research? Do people openly share it? Is it not transparent? Is it closed? Can we do that better? All the way through to asking quite big questions about things like, how do the structures and incentives and processes of how we do research, how do they either promote or sometimes get in the way of good research behavior? So one of the things that I care a lot about is how like scholarly discourse is done. So how do we interact with one another as researchers? How do we engage with one another's work? How can we do research in a way that is kinder and more constructive? Who is recognized in the research that we do? Who is included as participants? How representative are samples? Like all of these really big and really important questions about the kind of nature of research and science itself. I love this stuff so much because I think that this provides like a way to ask questions about culture in a way that is really tied to like strong methodologies and asking questions in a rigorous and empirical way. And these are the kinds of questions that outside of my kind of pedagogical research over the past few years that I've been asking of research generally. And what I'm now excited about is thinking about, so this kind of slightly weird area of like scholarship of teaching and learning, pedagogical research, educational research, like what might this offer the meta science conversation and vice versa. So that's what I mean by meta science. There's lots of definitions. This is what I mean by meta science. It's research about research. It's thinking about how we do things differently. So one of the big kind of things that meta scientists have been advocating for is this idea of conceptual clarity. And I love this. I love this so much because the kind of conversation about conceptual clarity, it basically asks, like, how clear are the actual concepts and constructs that we use in our research, which as psychologists, this is like our bread and butter, right? Like um, how do we conceptualize different constructs? Do we have a shared understanding of what different constructs mean? And importantly, how does this relate to measurement practices? So there's some really, really kind of vocal and passionate meta scientists, so people like Jessica Flake and Eike Fried, who have really made the case that as psychologists, we need to make sure that we don't just look at kind of process and we don't just look at product, but that we look at measurement. So they wrote this beautiful paper that's one of my favorite papers ever called Measurement, where they were saying that the time has now come for us to look at measurement clearly and to make sure that the actual concepts that we use in our studies are tightly defined and that are clear and that we have a shared understanding. And people like Gordon Hodson have written really nice papers as well about how if we're not careful about conceptual clarity, it creates what he calls conceptual blurriness or messiness. So it means that we don't really know what we're doing with our research because all the concepts are messed up, and we don't have clarity and precision of what we're doing. So I was kind of watching all of this unfold and thinking, actually, there's a lot of learning that particularly in the slightly unique context of pedagogical research, that a lot of this could kind of inform one another. So I think that one of the places where meta science kind of started is this look on measurement and about concepts. So what are the concepts and constructs that we're using, and are we using them with clarity and precision? So this is one of my favorite graphs ever. I wish I'd written it. It's so good. So this was a paper that was published this year, and it basically makes the case that we have a conceptual clarity issue in psychology. So this paper was Anvari and colleagues basically mapped out all of the different concepts and constructs that psychologists use in the literature. So, and made the point that we have what they call fragmentation. So basically that we use way too many different labels for constructs that are essentially the same thing, and that we have this kind of proliferation of different constructs, which leads to this proliferation of different measurement, which leads to a literature which is ultimately fragmented and distorted and messy. So what this graph shows, not graph, what do I mean? Figure. What this figure shows is every tile here is a measurement, is a tool that psychologists have used to measure something. So the big one in like the top left, the big kind of, what colour is that? Orange, maybe, is the Beck's depression inventory. And that's the biggest because in the literature, that's one that's used quite a lot. As you go like down the figure, the ones that are in white in that final corner are measurements, so scales that have been used and that have been never ever cited. So they have been what do I mean, created but never cited. And what this paper basically points to is that there are some of these measurements that are used quite a lot and have dominance, but there are these kind of unnecessarily large number of different measures that are essentially potentially measuring the same thing. And we even have this kind of pocket of the literature where people are validating and creating scales that nobody is citing and that nobody is using. And they use this to call upon psychologists to kind of take conceptual clarity seriously and to fight back against the fragmentation of the literature, which I think is a really like neat argument. So I think that this is really important for pedagogical research because as Carol Evans in one of my other favourite papers about high quality pedagogical research, what they argue is that everything that we study in pedagogical research, because it often has quite an applied nature, so because we study something because it actually impacts student outcomes or students' experiences, that it needs conceptual clarity, and quite urgently needs conceptual clarity, because this is important for things like validity. So are we, are we measuring what we think we're measuring? And reliability, are we measuring that thing well? And what the Evans paper talks about is it kind of soft launches this idea of maybe we need to get a little bit meta with how we think about concepts in pedagogical research to make sure that we're not kind of using constructs in a way that creates further fragmentation, and to make sure that we're always advocating for validity and reliability. And there's also generally, and there's another paper by Jessica Flake where she makes this argument, that there's generally a lack of attention that's being paid to what could potentially be evidence of conceptual clutter or conceptual messiness, specifically in the context of pedagogical research. And so we was, the three of us, myself, Pam and Rich, we were thinking about this quite a lot. And we were also thinking about why this might matter. So there's kind of these two fallacies in the measurement literature, this idea of, and I love saying them, I think it's fun to say, jingle jangle, that it's really easy to treat two variables as if they're fundamentally the same variable. So lump variables together, where actually conceptually they're different, which is the jingle fallacy. And it's also easy to treat two variables as if they're different because you give them different names, where ultimately conceptually they're the same thing. So we started thinking about this, and we were like, actually, there might be value in bringing this language to how we think about the scholarship of teaching and learning and how we think about pedagogical research. So we were kind of watching this unfold in psychology, and thinking what are the lessons that we might learn specifically in the context of pedagogical research, which is kind of where we hang out most of the time. So then we started thinking, what are the concepts that we have used so far, even just between the three of us? What are some of the concepts and the constructs that we are kind of drawn to in the work and the scholarship that we've done? And we thought, actually, there's quite a lot. So in our work and in the work of our kind of lab group at Leeds, then we have looked at all of these different constructs and concepts. So we've looked at things like student belonging, student mattering, engagement, community, well-being, voice, like all of these different things. And we thought that actually there is this sense of a kind of proliferation of different constructs, which got us thinking, well, how many of these are actually fundamentally the same thing? So the jangle fallacy, and how many of these are actually, they're actually different things, but we're missing it because we're lumping constructs together. So we thought, okay, this could be interesting. Let's take one of these, and take one of these where it feels like there's the most energy and interest, and start doing some meta-scientific work to investigate what's happening. So the construct that it was usually because students were coming to us every single year and asking if they could do their undergraduate dissertation on this, the construct that was kind of people were being drawn to was this idea of the imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. So we kind of took all of our work, picked one of the constructs that we were most interested in, thought, let's do a deep dive on what this thing might be. So the imposter phenomenon. So I know that there's some people, some dark P people who have like been thinking about this and talking about this. I'm super excited and interested to like chat more about this. But this, so we thought, okay, let's take a concept and see what's going on here. What was fascinating is that about 3 years ago, we kind of had this thing where between the three of us, almost every single undergraduate student, when we asked them what they wanted to do their dissertation on, bearing in mind we say we want it to be kind of pedagogical, student experience stuff, everybody all of a sudden wanted to study the imposter phenomenon. And when we asked why, they were saying, oh, well, it's a huge like zeitgeist. Well, they didn't use that word, but they were kind of paraphrasing the zeitgeist thing happening, that because of stuff that's happening on kind of TikTok, in the media, online, and in the literature, that this idea of the imposter phenomenon was becoming like this concept that students were being drawn to a lot. What was also interesting is that when we tried to map out some of the literature on the imposter phenomenon, we physically couldn't keep up with the amount of new studies about this construct, specifically in the context of undergraduate students. So every time we tried to write our literature review, almost every single day, there was a new study that was either correlating imposter phenomenon measures with something, or examining experience of imposter phenomenon, or doing something about this idea. So just very briefly, so originally the imposter phenomenon it was coined in 1974, might be 1978. And it was originally conceptualized to refer to the experiences of high achieving corporate professional women in the workplace. And it was supposed to kind of refer to this idea of women who felt like their positions were a result of fluke or luck or chance rather than because they'd earned it. So there was people who, in the original conceptualization, experience imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. The idea was that it was this sense that your achievements aren't your own, it's luck, and therefore you're going to be found out. And it's kind of the literature's sort of moved on a little bit now, but there's a huge amount of kind of energy at the moment in research of people investigating this thing in a student population. And we thought this is fascinating because is there evidence that there's kind of conceptual clutter in some of this research? So we did a couple of different things. So the first thing we did is we just wrote about it. So what we did is we kind of looked at the literature and said, actually, there is some evidence that there's these kind of jingle jangle fallacies happening. So in some of the papers that we read, the authors are talking about how they are measuring imposter syndrome, how they're interested in imposter syndrome, but then the validated measures that they use in their studies it's about academic perfectionism, or it's about self-esteem, or about sense of belonging. So we were like, there's actually some early evidence that we might be conflating different constructs in this one little pocket of the literature. There's also people who do the opposite. So they talk about imposter syndrome, but then the way that they conceptualize it in the like discussion sections of these papers is they say this really matters because it's impacting self-doubt or it's impacting self-esteem. And we thought, well, this is fascinating because what this suggests is that there may be this evidence of some kind of jingles and jangles and conceptual blurriness, and potentially a lack of conceptual clarity and precision with how people are talking about this one construct. And there's been a lot of people talk about this in different pockets of the literature. So there's quite a lot in the context of people talking about student engagement, for example, like how often do we say engagement, but then our measure is about attendance? And it's like they are conceptually different things, I think. They are conceptually different things. So let's have precision and clarity with what we're talking about. So we were interested in this and we were kind of writing about it and basically warning about, make sure that we're not saying one thing and measuring another. Because this could limit the extent to which we can use this research to say something practical and meaningful. And then that led us to this kind of bigger point, and this is where we start to get a little bit empirical, where we were like, okay, well, do we have evidence for conceptual and methodological clarity when we just look at this one slice of pedagogical literature, when we just look at the imposter phenomenon? So what is going on here? So we did a bunch of stuff and ran a load of stuff. So the first I'm going to do these relatively quickly because I think it's more the message rather than the method. But if you're interested, I can send you these. Some of them are available as preprints. Some of them have been published. They're all at various different stages. So the first thing that we did is we looked at whether there's evidence of this kind of conceptual blurriness. So we got 434 students and we basically just gave them a battery of different tests, including validated measures of the imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. And so things like sense of belonging, social anxiety, self-efficacy, and basically found, as you might expect, that everything correlates with everything, so that there's really, really high correlations amongst these constructs. But particularly is in our analysis, there was almost near perfect overlap between a measure of imposter phenomenon and a measure of perfectionism. So we thought actually this could mean that we have some of that evidence of a jangle fallacy where we're treating these two things as separate, but fundamentally actually are they the same thing? And that could help us to kind of tighten up and defragment some of the literature. We were like, okay, this was a student project. So we were like, okay, there's some evidence that these things might be correlated. Then we looked at, okay, well, for something to have conceptual clarity, a lot of the literature kind of uses different constructs and different concepts and treats them as if they can be universally applied to all students. And we were interested in the idea of, well, is the imposter phenomenon something that is conceptually universally applicable to all students so that we can measure it in this kind of cross-sectional quantitative way, or are there real cultural nuances that we need to be aware of? So there's a huge amount of literature on this, but we also ran a study where we looked at specifically for students who were South Asian studying at UK universities. We did some qualitative work where we looked at their experiences of the construct of imposter phenomenon. And basically what we found is that their experiences of what it means to be an imposter were super duper culturally bound. So the experiences that they talk about were fundamentally different to, for example, some of the items of the scales that are purported to measure imposter phenomenon objectively. So they were saying things like, actually what it looks like to them is it's the experience is about being othered, that there's a culturally kind of mandated thing about perfectionism where they're really encouraged to be perfectionists, and that they experience imposter phenomenon specifically through this lens of needing to be academically humble, which kind of heightens some of those experiences too. So what this kind of led us to think is that actually there may well be like huge cultural and kind of contextual variations in how the imposter phenomenon is experienced, which does actually slightly trouble some of the like methodologies and approaches that just use kind of one singular validated scale to measure all students' experiences. And there's a huge literature out there about how different groups of students experience this thing differently. And to me, that's Metascience when you ask questions like that. So we were like, okay, so there's evidence that it might correlate with a load of things. There's also evidence that it might look different to some students versus others. So what do we kind of do with that? So then we thought, okay, well, maybe there's something here about looking specifically at the measurement. So instead of looking at what does the construct or concept of imposter phenomenon look like, let's get really meta and look specifically at how people are using it in terms of how they're measuring it. So our argument here is that if something isn't measured properly, then it kind of everything falls slightly flat. So if we could have all these beautiful, well-meaning interventions that are trying to impact something, if the way that we then measure it, as in the tool that we use to measure it, is wrong or not exhaustive or doesn't quite work, then we don't really know whether our intervention works, right? Like we know this. And we had done some work, or I'd done some work with some colleague previously, Joe Mason, who's the first author of this paper, was a student. He did this as part of a BPS, don't pay, a BPS undergraduate research assistantship. And we kind of used the methodology of this to inform our work. And we basically showed that there might be value in just asking people what they think of the measures that we use in our research. So this study with Joe, we got a load of kind of non-expert people, gave them a load of psychology measures and interviewed them and said, like, does this measure make any sense to you? Like if you were asked to do the big five, if you were asked to do a self-efficacy scale, like, can you actually make sense of these questions? Or are we using all of these scales and tools and measures without actually checking whether anyone knows what we're talking about or not? So inspired by that methodology, then myself, Pam, and Richard took this approach and thought, okay, well, let's apply that to this question we have about the imposter phenomenon. So important caveat, we're not the only ones who are asking this. So there's a growing body of literature of people who are looking specifically at measurement. So looking specifically at how is imposter phenomenon measured? Is it measured properly? Do we have too many measures? Are those measures good? And we were kind of watching this unfold and became quite inspired by it. Also became quite inspired by the value of qualitative methods and of actually saying to students, instead of just looking at the statistical validity and robustness, let's just ask students if this measure makes any sense to them. So that's what we did. So we got 20 undergraduate students in focus groups of about 4 or 5, and we gave them the most widely used measure of imposter syndrome, which is the Clance Imposter Phenomenon Scale. And we literally said to them in focus groups, what do you think this measure is measuring? And then halfway through the focus groups, we said, okay, surprise, it's measuring this thing called imposter phenomenon. Do you agree? Do you think it's exhaustive? Do you think it's clear? Could you answer all the questions? Like, how good is this? Like, let's interrogate this measure in a way that goes beyond, oh, well, it has great Cronbach alpha and it has great statistical reliability. Like, let's try and embed some student voice in this kind of meta scientific view of our measurement practice. So this is generally what we found. So what we did is we asked all these students about the measurement, and then we did like this deductive content analysis where we looked for specific markers of reliability and validity. So we went looking for evidence of 2 different types of reliability, 2 different types of validity. And we found generally that when we said to students, does this measure from your point of view have stability? So would your answers be the same over time? They were like, no, 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 no. So a lot of students in our sample were saying, if you gave me this question in the morning, it would be different to if you gave me it at night. If you gave me it before a lecture, it would be different to if you gave me it like just before bed. Like or at different points in the semester, it's different. So they were saying that I would struggle to answer this question because it just depends. It's just different over time. They were saying, however, that the internal consistency, so the kind of how things lump together, that they thought that was fine. They were like, they all seem to be quite similar, and they all seem to be measuring imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. But importantly, they also said that there are some of experiences that they have that they feel like an imposter that are not captured in this scale. So some students were like, well, actually, in my friendships and in my social kind of settings, I feel like very much of an imposter in those settings. But that's not what the questionnaire is asking about. So there's bits of this construct that aren't being captured. And we think, and maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, but we think this is really important because if we just reach for the same measures as psychologists interested in student outcomes and experiences and don't think properly about what the limits of those measures might be, then that can mean that we're kind of potentially going down the wrong track with some of our research, and that also that we're missing things. So, for example, this idea of students feeling like an imposter in social settings, if all the measures that we use don't tackle that, then we don't know if our interventions are actually improving things. We're just not asking the right question. So in a nutshell, I've just given you 3 big old studies, but in a nutshell, so the imposter phenomenon literature, this is just one example, and we're doing a huge amount more follow-up work, as you might imagine. I'm trying to like suss this out a little bit more. We do think that there is some conceptual messiness about how we talk about these different ideas. And that isn't to say that there's any research that is wrong or inaccurate or questionable. It's just more about having the language and paying attention to where things could be conceptually tighter so that we can inform kind of interventions and things better. It also leads to some really interesting questions, right? Like, so often when I present this work, people say, they're like, well, does it matter if students don't like the measure because statistically it is robust? And I think this raises some really, really important meta-scientific questions, right? About what matters. Does the statistical on paper rigor of a scale matter, or does the experiences of people who are asking to do that stuff matter? And when those 2 things are in tension, maybe that's what matters. We also think that there is a huge opportunity to center student voice in when we think about concepts. So going back to the idea of engagement versus attendance, like are those two things conceptually different? And do students think that attending is the same thing as engaging? And like what's the student experience here? Because that might help us to tighten up and clarify some of our conceptualizations. And just briefly, just to take home, so just to kind of caveat this, we're not the only people who are talking about this. There are loads of people, including Louise, who I think is here, who wrote this beautiful, beautiful paper about how we could kind of tighten up higher education learning and teaching through kind of, particularly in a quantitative sense. There's also this paper that I mentioned about how do we know that our higher education pedagogical research is high quality? What does quality look like? And this paper makes the case that quality in pedagogical research may well look different from quality in other pockets of research. But I think that there's a huge opportunity now for, I've said subtle, I mean kind of subtle pedagogical research, dark P things to join in with this meta-science movement and meta-science conversation. I think that centering student voice is important, and I think that this it feels like meta-science is where a lot of kind of research culture stuff is going, and I think that if we're clever, we could have real fun with this as people interested in pedagogy as well. So thank you very much. Also, just to shout out again to my two collaborators, Pam and Richard. This is very much a kind of a power trio, and I'm just the one presenting it. But thank you very much, and I'm super interested to hear questions and comments, and thank you.
Cool. Thanks very much, Maddie. I've got to confess, I'm not very up to speed with Zoom, so I will actually clap rather than maybe we can get a clap through from the Dark P audience. I don't know. Yeah, I'm seeing a few virtual claps going on. I think so. We're quite able to kind of stay online. I think this session was originally due to go to about 1:30. Suggesting we do that, but certainly we go as long as there's questions. But I'm aware the Dark P people are going to have to shoot off to the next session soon. So are there any questions in the room from Dark P about the presentation? Anything at all?
– Sorry, just trying to find the unmute button. Does anyone have anything they want to ask in the room? Shakes of heads. We all agree, Maddie. It was amazing. Thank you so much.
That was the most unnerving thing, to have like zero response.
I know. Sorry. Well, we are here. We did applaud, but we were muted.
Thank you.
Can I ask, in the room, approximately how many people are in the room? Because Louise wanted me to keep a count of how many people are attending the seminars.
10.
About 10. Cool. That's grand.
Hi, 10 people.
Cool. People can put questions in the chat if they want, or anything, or they can just sort of unmute themselves if they want. Feel free to. Anyone online with any questions? I have tons. I mean, this might just turn into a chat offline after the seminar is over if there's no more questions.
It might.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I just hit you all with quite a lot. Sorry.
I had one about open science in Edinburgh, to make open science more appealing to everyone across the university. It's been rebranded. I mean, I don't think other people, but it's been called open research. So it's not just science. But as someone who moved from a psychology department into a school of education, I did notice a really big shift in culture in terms of awareness or kind of comfort level with open science or open research and open research principles and concepts. And I just wondered, because we talked about this a little bit previously as well, like, what's your feeling more generally in higher education about, because I think in your presentation you're very much open science is here, it's a mature discipline, we're ready to go. Is that psychology specific still, or what's your feeling on that?
I think that's a really good question. And it was, so brief story time. So in January, I was speaking at the University of Bath and was giving what I was like, oh, just to summarize, like here is the kind of plotted history of open science. And it was really interesting because what I didn't realize until way later in the presentation is how interdisciplinary the audience was. And there was loads of things that I kind of did quite quickly of like, there was a concern about like research fraud. There was this paper about questionable research practices. There was this thing about replication crisis, open science, bish, bash, bosh, that's what happened. And there were loads of people from different disciplines who were like, well, I didn't realize that's where it had come from in psychology. Like that was the story. And I think it made me realize how siloed some of these histories are. It was also really funny because in the same event, I started talking about like, oh, I think that reflexivity and positionality is a thing that we need to do to improve the integrity. And there was like all these sociologists who were like, yeah, like we know, like well, that's our whole thing, like that's what we talk about, that's like our whole disciplinary identity. And I was like, oh, and I think that there's yeah, I think that the kind of the history and the legacy of where open science has come from has shaped it. And I think particularly in psychology where there's because I think it's a difference between being like, oh well, there's this thing that's come from a concern about fraud and questionable practices that's going to feel very different versus how can we do things better in a more collegiate way. Like I imagine that framing changes how people interact with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have one follow-up question, but before that, there's a question in the .p room about Maddie, how on earth do you find the time to do all this? Which I think is maybe speaking to the challenges of being a oh, you've already replied with iced lattes, is that
that was a sort of half joke and also half not joke.
Yeah.
I think just like well I think so that a lot of what I presented here was like student project work or stuff that I've kind of done in like collaboration with Pam and Rich, and I think that every time I present this stuff about conceptual clarity it leads to a list of like now there's 5 studies that I want to run, and I think that's why I'm so happy to see like other people who are applying this like meta scientific stuff. I think we could do a bit better, as in we, the collective we, of like joining forces a little bit and being like, okay, well, what are the most pressing challenges and how can we kind of do things more collectively? So I really like doing like big team science stuff and that kind of thing of, well, lots of hands make light work approach. And I think that that's definitely also like a big meta science thing where it's like, well, what if we work together a little bit more and kind of pooled and shared resources? So I think part of the reason I'm really excited to be at the DART-P conference, although I'm not really, is to put out a bit of a thing of like maybe we could start tackling some of this as a collective.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks so much, Maddie. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think we have to head off now, but thank you so much for your time and for your talk. And obviously feel free, guys, to carry on without.
Oh yeah, I've got a couple more questions if that's all right.
Yeah, we'll back out now, but thank you so much.
Have a good conference.
See you.
Yeah,
Thank
enjoy
you.
yourselves. Bye. Cool. Yeah, so I feel like I'm almost interviewing you for some sort of like piece now. But that was really fascinating. So anyone else on the call, please feel free to join in. But those two things you said there. So one was like going back to the first question I had was about like that level of awareness and knowledge that people have of open science. And I think there's an interesting question there around where it came from. And one I often get here and I don't think it's unique to my position is, but does any of this stuff apply to qualitative research? Which I know you will have a response to. So I'll tee you up for that one. And the other thing you were talking about, like joining forces and kind of collaborative approaches, which open science really speaks to as well. When I was watching your presentation, I had certain thoughts about like when you're talking about that fragmentation effect or kind of imposter syndrome. You know, we're talking about this thing, but we're calling it imposter syndrome in our paper because that might increase its likelihood of getting published. Or fragmentation, I often think of like, well, create a new scale or do a new intervention, and that'll be the centerpiece of your PhD, and that's what science should look like.
Yeah.
I think, I guess a lot of that is speaking to like, where do you think we need to change, like in those professional practices to incentivize better science?
Yeah. Oh my goodness, I'm literally writing that down. I think so. I think with the second point, that I think that these things, I think the reason why we have such fragmentation is because that is how academia has set us up. Like there are incentives, just as you described, that there are incentives to, oh, make a scale because then people will cite it and that'll be your like pet thing. Just as like we have fragmentation of theory in social psychology because there's this culture of, well, if you have a pet theory that's your theory, then you're the person who's that theory person. And you look at these and you're like, I think these are the same theory. I think this is the same thing. All that it's like we already have a theory that could explain that, but there's this kind of genius scientist culture, which means that you are incentivized to have your own pet thing. And I think
have also learned this word plurification, which kind of speaks to that. Like I'd never heard that before today, but it kind of fits with that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And like, because it was funny because I remember like I was speaking to someone about this. It was like a PhD student who was like, I want to create a new scale. And I was like, there is a scale. And it was about, for something like student well-being or something. And I was like, I think we've got one. Like, I think we've got that covered. And they were like, oh, but isn't it cheating to just take it off the shelf and borrow someone else's? And I have this same response when I say to students, because I generally encourage undergraduate students to do conceptual replications for their project, because I'm like, oh, you've got a nice tight like method and you're adding, and a lot of them are like, well, that's cheating because I'm not doing my own thing. And I think that's because of the way that we view what a scientific contribution is, that it has to be new and sexy and shiny rather than this cumulative approach of like someone takes it this far and then you take it that far and then you look at it through a different approach. So I completely agree, and I think that that's also why there's barriers to doing this kind of collaborative stuff, is that it's like, but whose baby is it? Like whose pet thing is it?
Yeah. Who's first author or senior author or
I think with the qualitative stuff, I think that could be a whole talk and is usually a whole talk. And the talk that I mentioned that I gave at Bath in January was about what open research means for qualitative methods. So I think that is literally a whole talk. I think I've got two big things. One, that I think that some of the standards that meta-science people are advocating for are fundamentally incompatible with qualitative research, like reproducibility, replicability, not standard. Therefore, we need to be careful that they don't become synonymous with rigour, which is my big concern. And two, that I think that there is a huge amount of learning that open research, open science could have from qualitative methods if it listened and cared enough. So I think that there's so much of the practice of qualitative research, like detailed field notes, like documenting everything transparently, like engaging people in the process, that I'm like, it kind of works both ways. I'm like, that stuff is the stuff that could massively help meta science. So I think that that's my short answer. That's the
that's really interesting. I know we've got kind of a working group here in our school, which is very much about trying to, mostly psychologists, about almost trying to preach the gospel of open science to the rest of the school and the other disciplines in the school. But a lot of that is led by people who are mixed methods or no, it's actually a broad church. There's some quantitative mixed methods and there are some qualitative, and I've learned a lot about qualitative place in open science from listening to them and a lot of the things that you've been saying there about there's some things that apply, there's some things that don't, there's as open as possible but as closed as necessary, with like sensitive interview comments and all this sort of thing. I'm aware. Have we got any more questions or anything more?
Can I just say one thing while people
absolutely.
So just a bit of a plug, is that so myself and some colleagues are setting up like a European focused community of practice for qualitative people who are interested in open research. But we're hoping for it to have like quite an applied sort of community thing. So like so whenever we see these instances where rigour becomes synonymous with reproducibility, then the idea is that we'll have this community that we can like quickly mobilize to respond to things. And we're hoping that we're gonna, if we get the funding, that we're gonna kick things off with a retreat in Leeds in October. and everyone will be very
cool.
welcome, and it's going to be
Cool. Well, yeah, please share the details. I do all the social media for TFun, so if you share them with me, it'll go across
Yeah,
TFun and all
great.
my colleagues as well. So yeah, up here, because I can think of a few people who'd be really interested in that. Yeah, great. I think we will wrap things up there then, because I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. But thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting. Someone was asking, do you have a reference list actually for your slides? Like, because I think your references are in your slides, but they're
Yeah, I'll make sure that the version of the slides I give you, I'll put them in, because some of the studies you presented are published, but some of them are pre-printy or in the review.
Oh, that'd be so helpful. Yeah, that was just one of the questions in the chat. Cool, that's great. Thanks again, Maddie. That's really
nice
wonderful.
seeing you, Leah. Nice seeing everyone else.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.